a wonderful presentation for us online, if you remember, early in the pandemic, and really gave us a lot of information that we did not know about Ann Arbor history. So we're a church that respects everyone's stories, and it's important to hear those stories. So without further ado, Bev, we welcome you and look forward to hearing from you this morning. So be thinking of questions and things that you want to bring up.
Wow. I really want to thank everybody for being here today, but I have to start out by thanking your church, because I was here a few minutes early, and I had a chance to sit downstairs and sit in the back and listen to the end of the sermon and the beautiful music. And the line that really hit me was the corrective power of love. And I think that is truly what this work that we do is all about. And how can our hearts be more open to doing the best possible job that God has placed us here to do? So I did have a slide presentation. I have the thumb. It's in my bag. But after listening to the service, it really reminded me of how important it is just to have a conversation, eye contact, and communication with the people who are present with us in the room. We don't have to be in a little tiny box on a computer anymore. We can be face-to-face, person-to-person. So I think what I'd like to do is, and of course, as I had that brilliant idea, I said to myself, your slides go with your words. Which of the slides would you have skipped over anyway to deliver your message? But time is a precious commodity today, because we have a new exhibit that opened up at the African American Cultural and Historical Museum on Pontiac Trail. It opens at 12 noon. Our docent is able to do what she needs to do until I get there. Our exhibit is actually a really good example of the type of work that happens when youth and adults and a community work together to bring our history to the light. And when I say our history, I'm talking about African American history, but what we have discovered is that whenever you talk about our history, you talk about everyone's history, because there's not one way to tell one story without telling the other. So how do we tell those stories? With honor, truth, integrity, vibrancy, without editing it. Another thing that I heard as I was listening outside was how God meets us where we are at. And that is basically the work that we do in history and community work when we're trying to engage people. We meet them where they're at. We don't define what that place needs to be. And one of the ways we do that with the African American Museum is through our Underground Railroad tour of Washtenaw County. And that tour takes people to different historic sites, some completely connected to the Underground Railroad, of which Washtenaw County has a rich history, but also to sites that are important to the history of the African American community. Ann Arbor, a university town; Ypsilanti, a university town; Washtenaw County, a farming, agricultural-based residential place. All of the stories of African Americans and white people and Greeks and Caucasians, Native Americans, all are woven into one tapestry that is the community that we live in. So we find that when people take the tour and talk, they start to make those connections. Our tour docent, Deborah Meadows, is pretty incredible because she tries to incorporate those connections that people make into tours that go forward. But we find that when the young people take the tour, they see something different. When a high school student goes out to the cemetery, Harwood Cemetery in Pittsfield Township, where the descendants of the family of Asha Array, who was the Underground Railroad conductor in Washtenaw County, they see those grave sites right next to the same families who lived in the farms nearby, the Roswell or the Prestons, who helped them in this Underground Railroad work. And they stand there, and in their youthful excitement, they're looking and pointing and can't believing. But at the same time, they're realizing we have been here a long time. Everybody stands a little straighter. Everybody gets a little deeper impression about what it means to be a resident, a citizen in the place that we live. So this past summer, the U of M Turner African American Services Council wanted to do a project that engaged the young people and the members of their council. They refer to themselves as senior citizens. But now, as each of us approaches that definition, it gets changed. Much like as baby boomers wanted to wear our blue jeans into these years, they all of a sudden had Lycra in them so that they can indeed stretch and fit so that we can continue to wear them. When our parents would say, "I can't see that sign," we just told them you need glasses and to stop driving. When we couldn't see the sign, all of a sudden you notice that they are now twice as big and illuminated so that we can continue to drive. So I have also been told that another term that people like is seasoned adults. Sounds a little salty to me, but I get it. So this summer, as we started thinking about the project had already been in formulation by the time they involved the museum. They decided that they wanted to do a dialogue on an intergenerational dialogue on the Great Migration. And right away, a person knows a dialogue is a conversation versus an interview. They had not quite figured out how they were going to do it, but they had 8 young people who were eager to have this interview, this dialogue with these adults. But what we found out in that process is that 8 children quickly doubles to their parents, their babysitters, their sisters. And you're all of a sudden, when you're working on a project that involves young people, you're actually working with the network that supports them. So it's important to know the name of the sisters, the mamas, the uncles, the dads, the brothers, the babysitter, who will pick that child up after the end of a project day. And it's important to come to the front door when that person shows up in the car to let them know that we have taken care of your most precious asset, our community's most precious asset, our children. So what we learned about working with the youth and collecting oral histories and community engagement, now that the museum is open, we're able to demonstrate. So one of the things that we had to learn and talk about was what caused the Great Migration. Now, it was caused primarily by the poor economic conditions of African Americans, as well as the prevalent racial segregation and discrimination in the southern states, where Jim Crow laws were upheld. Its mission, once migration ended, because when the South had sufficiently changed in the 70s, African Americans were no longer under pressure to leave and were free to live anywhere that we chose. Now, it can be said that every person was impacted by the Great Migration. This is a documented exodus of more than 6 million African Americans from the Deep South to the North, the Midwest, and the West, in search of opportunity from the 1910s to the 1970s. The Great Migration touched every facet of American life, transforming cities and towns across the nation, including Detroit and Washtenaw County. But this major and long migration passed through sundown towns and other places that were so dangerous for people of color that we would drive through the night. Now, this was a habit that was hard to break, even for my own parents. When we started out on summer vacations, on our car trips, we always started right when the sun came up, and we were checked into the hotel that we were going to be staying in before the sun went down. The only navigation my parents had was a compass on the dashboard that many of you may remember. We never knew if it really worked or not. It just continually spun around, possibly because we were always turning to go back in the right direction. We had that AAA triptych map that my mom would be flipping and flipping, which seemed like endless. Will we ever get to where we're going? And we also had no cell phones, no internet, no way of calling ahead to see what was happening in the town that we were going to. And even as young Black children, we were very much aware of the risk of leaving our well-situated neighborhood that bordered Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. I was born and raised into an Episcopal church. Never had a fear of my own personal safety, but well aware of the history of my people and the history of this country. So when we would arrive at the hotel, Mom would go check in while Dad waited with us in the car. You can imagine 4 children between the ages of 6 and 15 traveling in the car for 7 hours. It felt like 7 years. I figured, and being told to look at the cows every mile, you know, kids, look at the cows, look at the cows. We saw every cow in America back and forth. We did get a little nostalgic on the way back as we got closer to home. It's like, oh, the cows, you know. But we figured that the sight of the 4 of us was probably more scarier to the hotel clerk than the fact that we were a Black family. But what we also discovered as we started filming these intergenerational dialogues at the museum with the Ann Arbor District Library was that story was very common. And it was common amongst different families for different reasons. So during part of our interviews, as we talked about race, history, where people were from, not always a comfortable or an easy topic, people were nervous in the room. When someone was telling their story, it is not ours to edit or to change or to judge. It is simply to listen. If we cannot find it in our heart to listen with compassion, we must find a way in our heart to listen with interest. And if we can't listen with interest, then we need to find a way to listen with intent. Because obviously, there has to be something in it for you for it to matter. So as we were doing our interviews, one of our subjects, her name is Janet. She's an African-American woman married to a Caucasian man. The interview happened to happen on the first anniversary of the passing of his life. So she was very emotional. Very emotional. She was wearing a cross that he gave her with his wedding ring around her neck and just continually holding it for comfort and for security. And for what he always brought to every situation, let's get it done. So I felt moved and necessary to tell the young man who was doing the interview that this was the morning of, so that he would be aware of maybe when the tears came as she told her story, that it was from that reason and not from something he had said. And as we worked with these young people, each one of them brought a different gift to their interview. There were a series of 8. And I am a middle child and a Pisces. I want everybody to have a good time and everything to go right. So when I saw one child get creative and innovative in their interview, I had to tell the rest, hey, you got to do something, because Delmar really asked a good question that wasn't on that paper. So, think of how you might improvise or help. Now, the person who was in charge of the project and who had coached these children had it all mapped out. And as she saw me start to help them, she began to understand that when you're working with people who are telling their story, it's a very fluid, intuitive process. It may not go as you planned, but it will go as it is supposed to. So as Janet started talking about her story and the Great Migration, and she started having these memories about her upbringing in Chicago. And one of the things that she said to us, and I will tell you that in this room at the time, there was Janet and Isaac, who was doing the interview, the 3 people from the Ann Arbor District Library, and 4 or 5 other people who were part of it. The one person who had finished theirs and wanted to hang around and hear the one after them, and then the other person who came early to be on time and to be prepared. And a couple of parents were there, because they were there, as many parents are, making sure that everything is going as it should. And so then Janet said, she says, I remember one of the things that my mother did when I was 12 years old, when Emmett Till was murdered. And as soon as she said that, the room stood still. People may not know who Emmett Till is, was, what happened, but they know the two words. They know the name. She said, I remember when I was 12 years old. Now, Emmett Till was a child of Chicago. He was born and raised in Chicago. When his mother determined that the world should see what white racism did to Emmett Till, she had his funeral, and she had his casket open so he could be seen. My mother took me, and I stood in line. And at that moment, every one of us, every age, every race, every anything, got the same chill, because we all had the common thread of the heartbeat of that story. Young Isaac said, "You saw?" She said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Wow." What? And this young man, as he was interviewing her, he was taking notes, because part of his process was to give back what he had heard from her as he formed his next question. Another brilliant sign of our youth, that when given the room, we see the flash and the development of that beauty and brilliance and inspiration. And she said, but it was at that time the reason that Black mothers and fathers and grandparents, aunties and uncles stood in line down the street, around the corner, up the street, to go and view his body, and took us kids with us, is so that we could fully understand what hatred and racism had done. That has lived with me all of my life. To this day, I cannot look at the picture of Emmett Till in his casket. I cannot do that, because it brings back all of that hatred, that racism, that fear, and all of that stuff. Now, you may not know his story, but you know his name. He was a 14-year-old African-American boy who was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of speaking to a white woman in her family's grocery store. So his mother had the funeral with an open casket so people could see what that had done. But we also learned in those interviews that the experience of going early to check into a hotel room was not limited to race. One of the men in the room told me afterward that every time he and his husband travel in their cars, usually one will go in and check in first while his husband waits in the car, for the very same reason that our parents, many people of color, will do, because of fear of the racism and prejudice that will be met at the check-in counter. So what we've learned is that true community engagement, whether it's Black Lives Matter movement, the Great Migration movements, or whatever your story, you're welcome here. It requires some key elements to make this work and for it to be successful. So as I was coming over here this morning, I stopped by the African American Museum first to make sure everything was still on the wall. So when I wouldn't get that phone call, hey, that stuff didn't stick on the brick. And I came up 4th Avenue, where as I passed Bethel AME Church, what used to be Bethel AME Church, and what used to be Second Baptist, I was reminded of a story that Rosemary and Blake had told me about when she was a young girl, and both of those churches had these congregations that were just a block and a half away. And she would say, on a warm summer afternoon, and I knew afternoon was the right word because folks was in church all day, you would hear one choir singing, "Are there going to be any roses in my crown?" And the other choir would be singing a hymn where the refrain would be, "No, not one." And she would talk about how vital and important church was to the community. And when she would say that, I would think the word "was" is the operative word, but that is not the active verb that we live with. Church is vital and important to the community, all communities. So whatever the story is, as I remembered the ones that I had been told, and I'm so happy to see you, Frankie, because one of the things that I wanted to share is there's a historian in Ann Arbor named Susan Weinberg. She's written several books, done talks and tours. And one day she says to me, "Hey, Bev, I found this photo of a church. I'm going to send it to you." And I got the picture, and it was a picture of a church that was on a storefront church in a Carytown building. It was Grace Apostolic. I'd never known about it. And I am not the smartest person in the world, so I don't claim to know everything, but there's a few things I kind of know. I'm like, I haven't heard about this. And I looked at the picture, and I said to myself, well, if there is a new Grace Apostolic, of course there has to be a Grace Apostolic. So I talked to Willis Patterson, who is my go-to on anything and everything, history or not. And I asked him about it, and he told me about that church and the other two holiness churches that existed in that community. And in that brief minute, I went from knowing there were two churches that were foundational to our community, but in fact there were 5, which tells me there's more. What we learn about our community and our people never ends. We just have to be expansive enough to always make sure that we can add it. So I will say, as we work on these type of things, that we want to make sure that we respect everyone's story. We don't edit it, we don't revise it, we don't correct it, and we have to hold ourselves back from walking up to the person and saying, "There's a better way," or "There's another way," or "There's an easier way you could say this." And part of that means really laying the ground rules for success of those type of conversations. One example is the use of the word in talking about our history, the use of the word slave. Many of us grew up talking about slaves. We know America had slaves. We understand this. But this is our time. It is our responsibility to reframe the picture. Slavery existed. It was the institution. But it was Africans who were enslaved. And then it became enslaved African Americans because the first generation born in the country is an American. And so when you call somebody a slave, past or present, it puts a mindset on a person that does not belong. And the urgency or the willingness or the desire of somebody to use a word as caustic like that in these times is indeed another conversation that everybody's not willing to have. But the words that we choose and how we choose them are so important in having real and authentic conversations about race and history. Now, in my daytime work, I'm the administrator for the Washtenaw County Historical Society, established in 1857, a long time ago. And I've always been a student of history, a child of history. I come from history. And I come from the generation that you learn all history because it's interesting and because it matters. So as we work with history, it's important that we create the vocabulary, we share the words that we're going to use, and we create the environment for how we listen and talk to each other. So as I thought about, on the way over here, I also passed the Ann Arbor Bus Transit Center, where the bus was stopping to let people off who had just come from the airport. And as they got off that bus, It was just another migration. The people moving, suitcases, phones in hand, handbags, purses, moving from one place to another, going back into life, just like the story of the Great Migration that we have covered at this museum. But then when I read the history of your church, it was also a story of migration, because the early beginnings of your church are traced to that log cabin built by John Allen on the northwest corner of what is now Main and Ann. And I understand from your history that everybody worshiped together in that place at one time. Catholics, Baptists, Episcopalians, Methodists, Unitarians and Presbyterians. And in cold weather, services were held in private homes. Kind of like what COVID did to us. We went from being together to separating into our own little satellites. But then, first the Presbyterians and then the Methodists began taking the seats apart and finally holding services at a different time from others. And that phrase really struck me, taking the seats apart. That is a physical, active separation of one from another. But then in 1847, 48 members of that Presbyterian church who had roots in Congregationalism were dissatisfied and disagreed with the minister who would not renounce slavery and began formal steps towards severance and to select a site for a new church. And 2 weeks later, the lot was selected and purchased. This church, originally built on the corner of 5th and Washington, was dedicated in 1849. But 2 years later, this church adopted a resolution against slavery, excluding from membership and as ministers any slaveholder or advocate or apologist for slavery. That's a strong, powerful stand to take. It is the foundation upon which your church is built. So when you say all are welcome here, we know you mean it. So just 23 years after the founding of Ann Arbor in 1824, and the very same age that Jacob Lawrence was when he painted the Migration series, this church was founded. And when Jacob Lawrence was commissioned to paint the Great Migration series, at 23, he's going to do a series of 60 panels that talk about the story of African American migration from the year 1920 to 1940. I know a lot of amazing 23-year-olds. I don't know if I would trust any one of them to really tell the arc of a story like that. But as so often the case, the women of the men breathe a life into a way of making things happen. And his wife said, "You've never been south. Your parents came from the south. You are a Great Migration story. We need to go south." And they traveled so that he could experience what he was going to paint about. So when he came back to Harlem, he's working on his series. He felt the power of all of the Harlem Renaissance artists, writers. He felt the power of the stories, and he created the images that are such beautiful, moving aspects. He wrote the captions for these panels, and so the captions themselves tell the stories. So the stories of people like that, the stories of the people who live here in our community, the stories of all the people in this room really live within these walls and walls like these. So whatever the story is, whether you're sharing it individually or collectively with a group of peers or even intergenerationally, we need to have places to tell it and people to hear it and open hearts to receive it. And I really want to thank you guys from the bottom of my heart today for spending this time with me, because I know you could be anywhere else. It's a beautiful day. It's been such a crazy weekend. I don't even know who won the game. I don't want to know, because I think Detroit still has to play. So, so thank you very much.
certainly open it up for questions, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about the museum, when it's open, and just kind of the basics of the history.
Absolutely. The African American Museum was founded in 1993 by 23 founding members who all just sort of had the idea that they wanted to have a museum, but none of us were historians. It has been located in different places, but currently located at 1528 Pontiac Trail. Beautiful house that also has history. It was built in the year 18, and I'm just looking at my notes because I don't want to get these dates and places mixed up. It was built in 1848 for Albert Pohemus and his family of 6. The interesting part about that house is that the Reverend Maltby Gelston Jr. from the First Presbyterian Church in Ann Arbor lived in that house at one time. It was moved to Pontiac Trail for the purpose of being a museum and also to have the offices of the Mosaic Foundation of Rita and Peter Hayden on the first floor. And the Mosaic Foundation and the Haydens have been tremendous supporters of the organization. I would say from probably the early 90s. They have followed us and have encouraged the development and wanted to have a place where the African American history could be kept and preserved. It is open on Saturdays and Sundays from 12 to 4, but we also encourage group visits and weekday visits. And I brought some flyers, not very many, but just about the exhibit with the information about how to contact us. And the exhibit closes in March 26 in 2023. One of the reasons why we wanted it to have a long life is we have discovered that living takes time. And you can't be in a rush to go every place and do everything all the time. And the exhibit before this one, Sankofa, was about the Art of John Lockhart. And when John Lockhart's exhibit was up, 2 things happened. And this also happens where I work at the museum on Main Street. And I think it happens in church. People don't always come to church when we're happy. A lot of times people come to church when we're in pain because we're seeking what we hope we get from being in a spiritual place, a certain kind of healing. Healing is too loosely defined as physical. It's mental, emotional, it's spiritual, it's everything. We sometimes don't even know what it is. So we found at John Lockhart's exhibit, so many Ann Arbor people had done Peace Corps work in Africa. So when they would come look at his paintings, they could point out symbols and people and tribes and things that we weren't even aware of. And then experiences would be told of what it was like to be the only white person in Nairobi who could speak the language and French and these other languages, and how, and the woman who was sharing that story also had a lisp. So she talked about the difficulty, but how ingenious it was for her to be able to move through these different cultures. And what we recognized is a lot of times people just don't have a place to tell their story. And they don't even have to be connected when we walk in the room. But when we leave, we understand what the connection and the purpose was. So hearing again like those words, the corrective power of love, it was so meaningful at that moment. We overthink everything. How am I going to? How will it happen? How will it work? But knowing that we trust he who is in charge. Sometimes it is the boss or your dad or your mom, but we know who he is. When you trust that and him knowing exactly what we need, those parting words were so powerful. The names of the unknown. I would just share this, and I know, we're at our time and it's closing, but when we talk about the unknown, you can be standing right next to somebody or talking to somebody and not know their name. And because you don't know their name, you may miss the opportunity to meet and know someone great. They don't have to be famous. They just have to be human. And how we get enriched from that experience is really what I believe is the gift of the work of history and community and the power of doing it intergenerationally. Young people, the one thing we heard from our young people at this last project, and it was hard to hear it at the end because as adults, we get pretty tired before the finish line. Like, yeah, okay, you made it, follow through, call me. And one of the things that we heard was they wished that there was a way for them to continue this. And what we recognized is what it meant, just one more event, an opportunity for the older people to interview the younger people. That would have brought it full circle in a way that would have made a dialogue even more complete. But it didn't bother us, because we know you can only get better when you have a room to improve. And before someone tells you all the other ways you can improve, you can take the one that was first given to you and take it to the next level. And so not only do we know we'll do that as a group, we like to share that as we talk to people who also do this type of work. It's a complete circle, and we'll go around a lot of times.
Questions? Mary.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk. But I really had not heard of Jacob Lawrence
Yes.
and his 60-panel
Yes.
paintings of the Great Migration. Where are those panels, and where could I view them? I mean, are they online too?
They are online, and when he created those 60 panels, what he did is he painted the panels first with brown and black backgrounds. And then he went around and as he did, layered on the colors. One of the things that happened right after the exhibit went up, it was the first art exhibit for an African-American artist that got national acclaim. It was so popular that Fortune magazine, and it's odd to say that when you talk about Fortune magazine, something that's totally out of print, but they highlighted 30 of his panels. Soon after his panels were created and publicized, the Modern Museum of Art bought half of them, and another institution bought the other half. But they are online, and if you just Google Jacob Lawrence Great Migration Series, you'll come up with the website that has all of the images and the explanations, and then the history context below the panels, which is really helpful because we lived through those times. But while living through those times, you're raising people, going to school, having a life. So the current event is not always in the foreground with all the details. So the beautiful part about the websites is that they have those to explore.
How lucky we are to have because some of them are in New York still.
Yes, yes, and some of them are in Seattle.
Oh,
And they've only been on exhibit together once in the last, 40 years. And we have permission to use them in the exhibit prints. But we have permission you can take photographs of the odd number panels, but not the even.
Oh, God.
So I'm like, okay, that makes it easier for people who say, can we take pictures? No. And when I put them up, as happens with every exhibit, if you're fortunate to handle artifacts or items that have beauty and meaning, you start to get a feeling for where things go, and he created them to be in a series. So they're up in the order around the room that they are in the series. And we don't have all 60, we have 25 or 26 of them. We had 25, but as I finished putting them up yesterday, I had one extra text panel, which told me that one of the print panels didn't make it into the box. Not a problem, because there's space on the wall to make 4 instead of 3, so I don't have to go move every other one.
Wonderful.
Yes, yes.
So they are part of this new exhibit.
Yes.
Yes,
We have some print ones that were selected by the task committee to tell the story of the Great Migration. So they're reprints. And when you reprint, you have to keep them at the same size. So he created them at 12 by 18 inches. And the first thing that came to my mind when I saw them was, hey, we can blow them up. No, you can't.
Ms. Willis, I just want to thank you for taking the time to come here. I mean, there's a lot you could be doing on an afternoon of the New Year needed at the museum, but you've invited us into a space to hear the story, and you've created that space, and I'm really inspired, and you may hear our church doing some type of similar intergenerational interview narrative, because that, I think, is incredible work, and I have no question, I just have gratitude. Thank you for sharing what you know with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think you really should absolutely do that, because this 2024 is building. People are going to look for history. Everybody's hungry for what is the history of our community? What is the history of our community? This church's story, founding members, congregational members from then to now, it is powerful. So as you tell those stories, and what we discovered is what the founder of Google told Aaron Dworkin when he came to Ann Arbor to talk to Aaron about his idea for doing these small, short interviews, to put them up online for people to learn from. I don't know how many of you know Aaron Dworkin or the Sphinx competition, but it's an African-American Latinos competition for classical music string performances. A multi-million-dollar, again, Dr. Patterson was part of the founding of that, very instrumental to Aaron in guiding him towards that. And one of the things that the founder of Google said is Aaron was giving his great idea, and I'm going to have the Saginaws and these people up. He said, well, how long are your interviews going to be? And Aaron's like, oh, pretty short, about 10 minutes. And the guy is like, And then Aaron is, well, I knew he'd already cut it by half when he gave that answer. He says, well, and the guy from Google, no, you need to have 1-minute clips, 3-minute excerpts, 7-minute interviews, sections. He said, so if you got an hour interview and you can't break it down, can't cut a thing, then you're going to need 6 chapters. So he started talking about how you break it down so people can click onto what they want to hear. Now that often comes out when somebody's presenting the editor for the project with one thumb drive with everything on it. He's like, you all should have told me this is what you wanted to do. In the beginning, I could have told you how we need to structure that. So when working on a project like that, think of the big picture. Think about how you want people to interact with that at the end. And you really want, and the internet now has gotten onto it, because if you Google certain things and you see the video files, you'll see where they give you specific clips within that video to go right to. So it's all about metadata, tag words, all the kind of things that technology has made so wonderful and possible for us to reach that person who's sitting in their living room who just wants to click twice. They don't want to go through it. So if they're interested in Great Migration, they see boom, 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 they can click. And that tagline has the name, so the person who did the interview and the person who's being interviewed. So if we can, and I would love as you work on that, if you'd like any input or just any, working together, we believe in doing working sessions that people participate in and are invited to outside of our working group, because they're usually the person who says, hey, you know how we did that? And we would never have heard that idea if they weren't invited to be part of the collective process of brainstorming. So I think you should definitely do it. I look forward to it.
Thank you.
Great. So I'll leave these flyers here. There's not too many, but